Tales of Symphonia, the 5th mothership title in the series. Wait, the 5th? Released in 2003? This game is legendary, and its legacy hasn't gone anywhere even after almost 20 years of existence. This is the first fully 3D Tales game, Europe's first Tales game, the first game made after the temporary split of Team Symphonia and Team Destiny. I'm sure you can guess which team made this one. And easily the most popular entry in the series. Tales of Symphonia is a JRPG well known by both fans of the series and dreaded outsiders. We'll convert them all someday, my children. Clearly, this is a very important game in the ever-growing franchise, and an entry quite a few of you were looking forward to in the retrospective. In fact, I myself was looking forward to it. I played through this game completely only once, but remember really enjoying it and putting it in my personal top 5 before the retrospective. I also did quite a bit of the post-game and looked up a bunch of scenes I had missed out on because I couldn't get enough of the game. But over time, I've started hearing more and more people saying that the game isn't as good as I remember, or that the experience as a whole was beginning to feel more dated as time progressed. Which brings us to the review at hand. Is it true that the game isn't as competently put together as I remember? Maybe its age has finally caught up to it. Well, I'll bite. Let's look at Symphonia next. The one most people associate the series with, a landmark of an entry and opinions shifting on it as time progresses and more people play it. Does Symphonia hold up in my eyes? Let's say our vows, pray to the goddess Martel, and dive into Tales of Symphonia. But which one? Tales of Symphonia has gotten a handful of releases. Originally, this was a GameCube game released on 2 discs because the sheer awesomeness of Tales couldn't be contained on just one tiny little donut. The game was later ported to the PS2 a little over a year after with some extra content and further accessibility, but it was, say it with me, Japan exclusive. I am so tired of that phrase, you have no idea. Fortunately, everyone else was given all the Japanese exclusive content only a short 10 years later when this version of the game was remastered for the PS3 in a bundle called Tales of Symphonia Chronicles. A neat little bundle that featured this game and another title that, we'll hold off on for the time being. It was a cool idea. Want to do it again? It was an easy and accessible way to play the games, not to mention had the PS2's additional content and more. Extra side quests, new costumes, more mystic arts. They replaced a GameCube in one of the dungeons for random mechanics, somebody just end me now. But along with various other things, the most important update was the game's visuals to proper widescreen and HD. This is cool and gives a fresh new take on Symphonia, apparently making it the way the game was intended to look like in the first place. There's just one problem, well, minus the lack of a GameCube in-game. The original version's battle system, and the entire game, now that I think about it, ran at 60 FPS. The PS2 version ran at 30, and due to this being a remaster of said PS2 version, yup, 30 frames, my dudes. Personally, I prefer a smooth 60 frames over Ultra HD graphics, so this bothered me quite a bit. Now, this isn't an issue if you're playing the game's final re-release, yes there's more, and that is on the PC with some handy-dandy modding. But if you didn't know, I'm a broke boy, and my laptop can barely run my editor. I was back and forth on which version of the game to record, but ultimately I left the decision up to you guys. The result? We're sticking with the PS3 version for proper HD. Guess frame rate doesn't bother you too much, huh? Well, alright, that's cool with me. The bits of extra content are appreciated, and I don't have to mess with recording off the GameCube and whatnot. So, Tales of Symphonia Chronicles it is. Regardless of which version you play, you're in for more or less the same experience. If you have the hardware, I'd say go for the PC version for mod support. The frame rate really does bother me that much. Not to mention it's constantly on sale, but again, my version should be fine. Why did I feel the need to specify? Well, I like to keep you all informed, and the version I'm playing is fairly important because, as usual, we're diving headfirst into Gonna be exclusively talking about the PS3 version now that we've established that's what version we're talking about, and the graphics for it are interesting. I remember saying I thought the game looked fine in my Grace's F review, but there's a reason I'm replaying these games and not going off of my memory, and not just because I need to capture the footage. I love the updated UI, cleaner text, and crisper sound quality, but that's about the extent of it. This is a remaster after all, so the visuals haven't gotten a total overhaul, keeping the way the original looked mostly intact, and that's not really a good thing if you ask me. Firstly, I'm not crazy about the character models. Let's look at Lloyd's portrait in the game's status screen. He's fairly tall, skinny, and looks like the determined shonen protagonist he is. Now let's look at his model. Does it properly convey the way he's supposed to look? In my opinion, no. And the same can be said for just about everyone else. They're so cartoony and exaggerated, short and stout, which clashes with the game's ridiculously dark story beats. I found moments not hitting as hard as they could have because the character models couldn't properly express everything that was happening in terms of their body language and animations. In fact, I would laugh at some scenes because the animation, or lack thereof, was ridiculous and a clear product of its time. A lot of Tales games, as you've most likely quickly noticed at this point in the retrospective, suffer from somewhat lackluster animation, but there were more moments spread out over the course of the games that got their act together and even started having more competently animated scenes in the likes of the Exilia duology and Grace's F. Here, it's just bad. One-handed juggle, anyone? Seriously, take a shot every time you see the animation in a cutscene. Ooh boy. A shot of water, of course. Don't give me that look, I'm a good boy. Fortunately, in battle, all the animations are clean, of course at their best in the GameCube and modded PC versions with a silky smooth 60 FPS. This is where the frame rate bothered me the most. I'm sorry if it doesn't matter to you, but it looks so good! You can really feel the weight and impact of attacks, like Lloyd's quick, sharp movements with his sword, the raw power of every swing Presea does, so on and so forth. The only visual aspect in battle I wasn't a fan of were those stupid magic circles. I don't know what it is, but I always hated them. They're so ugly. There are also plenty of textures that just look bad. Going back to the models, their JPEG faces are not my cup of tea. Or my cup of coffee. Hot coffee. Or is it? As if their lack of animation didn't hinder this enough, characters struggle to properly express themselves in a wide range of situations and take me out of the experience pretty often. I want to emphasize that I understand HD remasters don't always get every little thing, and I never go out of my way to look for this stuff, but a lot of it was thrown right at me. This includes environmental details in the likes of dungeons, towns, and especially that world map, which I'm pretty sure is being held together by duct tape and hot glue. Seriously, I can see the seams of world map tiles all over the place. Even enemy models and designs are so ridiculously cartoony and generic, which doesn't bother me as much as the important characters, but at the same time, they aren't memorable, and over the course of my playthrough, I found myself forgetting so many of these guys. Was that just me? I've never had this problem in other Tales games, but hey, at least they look more involved than the black blobs that represent them in the world map. The heck are these? I wonder how hard it would have been to replace these with their proper models for the PS3 and PC releases. Oh, and I almost forgot that this game was a part of the time frame where Tales games would occasionally get CG cutscenes, and they're alright, I guess. They're super short almost all the time, but I guess when they popped up they looked fine. Sorry, I don't mean to sound cynical or anything, but they never really stuck out to me. Every time they'd pop up, I'd say, oh, cool. And that would be that, so not impressed. Man, I've been complaining about the game's visuals a lot, huh? Yeah, not even gonna try sugarcoating it. I've never been a fan of Symphonia's graphics. You get used to it all the more you play the game, but every time I come back to it after a while, I'm taken aback. I say this because when it comes to the game's art direction, I'm a huge fan. I really love these character designs as they're incredibly iconic and recognizable from a distance. The way this game builds its world with its architecture and distinct look is so darn good. I wish the game's scaling was a bit better though. This was somewhat of an issue in other Tales games going forward for a bit, but here it's straight up impossible to ignore. One more step and I'm on this game's genocide route. The game's color palette is really nice too, very vibrant and easy on the eyes to further help everything stick out. Then there are anime cutscenes, which I believe to have gotten the best upgrade in this remaster in regards to this game's presentation. They've been up-res to proper HD and it comes across as if this was the way they were always supposed to look like. It's just a shame that they're rarely if ever voiced, which I thought was a little lame. Speaking of voices, let's talk about the voice acting. This was the second Tales game to be dubbed over in English, with the first game featuring English voices being Tales of Eternia. As such, my expectations weren't terribly high for voice performances, but I was very surprised by how solid it was the whole way through. There are some really talented people behind these voices, making every scene a treat with proper delivery and emotion. There are some awkward lines every now and then, which is to be expected, but overall I was impressed. So why the heck are there so many scenes without voice acting? There are tons of long stretches in the game where scenes simply weren't voiced, and this bothered me so much. It feels kinda lazy and cheap. Almost every Tales game preceding it, Vesperia got the memo eventually, made it the standard that at the very least all story scenes would be voiced. So it just stung a bit coming back to this game, especially when there were a couple of optional side quest voiced and like, cool, but voice the main story first, please. There were even some scenes that started without voice acting, then would get voiced later on, like, what? Heck, even skits aren't voiced. Skits! Now you may be saying, well Zafer, it's one of the first Tales games to feature voice acting, and voicing skits would be too much, and I'd be inclined to believe you, if the Japanese dub of the game didn't have fully voiced skits. One of the perks of the PS3 version of Symphonia and up is having dual audio that you can switch between at any point in the game's pause menu. This is a great feature for those who prefer one language over the other, or even want to switch back and forth whenever they're pleased, meaning you can switch to the Japanese dub before a skit so you don't have to sit in awkward silence. But man, does it suck that the English voice cast couldn't get to flex their talents and give the characters more life in these. This was probably a financial decision, but it's still annoying. Also, I don't know if this was just me, but sometimes the music drowned out the characters' voices, so I wish the audio balancing was a bit better in a few instances. It didn't happen often, but enough for me to take note of it. Is there one part of the presentation that's completely good? Yes, the soundtrack. I love this game's soundtrack. From the very first playthrough, I enjoyed just about every track in the game, or at least so much of it that I didn't care to think about or even remember the weaker ones. So many songs stuck in my head, and I found myself humming to a lot of the tunes while gathering footage. It's one of the Tales soundtracks I listen to a lot of my free time for being iconic and straight up filled to the brim with quality. And there's a lot to it too, which only gives it more brownie points. A major aspect as to why I love this soundtrack as much as I do is not only thanks to dungeons, towns, battles, and the world map all having top tier songs, but the cutscene music is pretty darn good too. This doesn't happen often in Tales games. Heck, I feel the only other Tales game with as good cutscene tracks are Vesperia and maybe Berseria to an extent, but here I remembered pretty much all the tracks and under which circumstances they'd play. Not to mention there are character themes. What the heck happened to these? Well, they haven't really gone anywhere, but more recent entries only give a handful of characters their own songs in the soundtrack. Here, every party member has at least one, some have two, and it's great stuff. This whole soundtrack is full of great stuff. I'd easily put it in my top 5 for the franchise. But other than that, yeah, the presentation's pretty mixed. So many parts of it I can just see being excused by a bunch of people saying, well, it was released on the GameCube. And I want to address that. I do not care when this game was released. I'm judging it based on how it holds up and how good it is as I'm writing this. In 2020, does this game look good, sound good, play well, etc.? That's what I care about. While I try to judge games with somewhat of an objective and critical eye, my personal preference is what trumps all else. And I couldn't care less if this game was good back in 2003 because it's not 2003 anymore. That's why we have terms such as dated and of all time, because products should be judged on how they hold up, not how good they were back then. At least that's how I feel, and because this is my video, that's how we're gonna do it. The character models, environments, textures, and all that technical stuff, even with an HD coat of paint, doesn't hold up well enough for me and does a poor job at representing the art design intended for this game. Apparently this HD remaster was how the game was envisioned to look in the first place, but I just don't see it. It doesn't feel like a competent enough new look to warrant being called that, but rather brushing it up just enough so that it can be seen as an upgrade good enough to be on HD consoles. The only part of the presentation I felt was made to be how it was originally intended were the anime cutscenes. But because of how rare those are, how much does that do for the game? I wish the game became fully voiced, or at least all the skits were voiced. I wish there weren't so many easily seen textures that look muddy. I wish I couldn't see seams for the overworld in a 2013 re-release. I wish the game ran at 60 FPS regardless of being based off the PS2 version. I wish there was more effort. I really do. The soundtrack is one of my favorites in the series, same for this game's collection of iconic and well-designed characters, and the voice work is excellent. As a whole though, presentation left a lot to be desired. And while it's something I got used to as I played the game, looking back on it, nah, not feeling it. Let's see if this next segment can pick things up, shall we? What kind of tale do we have today? Our story begins in the world of Sylveron as we join up with this group's protagonist, Lloyd Irving. Sleeping in class, of course. Gotta have our shonen protagonists in their natural habitat. Today marks the day that one of Lloyd's friends and totally not love interest, Colette, is beginning her journey for the world's regeneration. Colette is Sylveron's chosen, and her job is to go to the world's many seals in order to rejuvenate its supply of mana. This is the world's major life force, as without mana, it's impossible for nature to flourish, action RPGs can never be the same, and magic is useless. Obviously, that's a big no-no. Lloyd, his best friend Genus, and Colette head over to the first seal that's near their hometown, but it's not the fun field trip they were hoping for. The place is beginning to become overrun with a group of people called Zions, shady guys who run human ranches and only keep their hands off the main character's hometown due to a peace treaty. The trio try to fight against them, but are struggling for a bit when they're saved by the certified badass, Kratos. With his help, they manage to take care of the first seal and kick off Colette's journey. Well, the next day it officially kicks off with some great scenes that I don't want to spoil because it's an excellent opening to the game, but yeah, this is our main story. The cast going on a journey to regenerate the world by releasing various seals across the land and getting Sylveron the energy it needs. The premise is very simple at first, which the game knows so that it can use that simplicity to evolve the narrative into the subvertive, deep, mature, and high-quality narrative it is. I love Symphonia's story, so much so that I'd say as of now, it's my second favorite in the entire series right behind Berseria. I found it that solid. It's a game that takes cliche concepts and bends them so damn well, and this is the standard I expect out of the series. While you're going through this journey, the game gives you little hints that make you think there's something going on, that things aren't as straightforward as they seem. Enough so that it piques your interest like crazy, and when the big reveal finally happens, it's so good. Even knowing what was going on in this most recent playthrough, I was grinning like an idiot at the mostly great foreshadowing, and I actually leaped out of my seat when the big twists were rolling in. Everything changes, it throws you for a loop and keeps you on your toes because the good stuff keeps on coming. It is a slow burn kind of story though. Before you get to the good stuff, which I'd say is a little before the halfway point, there's plenty of downtime while you travel to other seals, some detours I could have gone without, and while most of the foreshadowing was pretty good, some of it was annoying. I wasn't fond of how much information was kept from the player by characters withholding information for poor reasons or just not wanting to open up to Lloyd. Could we not have had more conversations between party members who weren't the protagonists besides the skits? I'm so tired of the phrase,
"No, it's nothing."
That phrase is banned. Seriously, there were so many times where a character would say something under their breath, another party member would say, "Huh? What was that?" To which the other would reply with that cursed line. Just say it! On top of that, there was another point in the game where you had to go to X amount of dungeons before progressing, which wasn't bad, just a bit lame after how smooth things were moving. And the handful of in-game paywalls to progress weren't too ridiculous, just jarring that they were even there. Also, you can't skip cutscenes. Like I said in the previous review, the inability to skip cutscenes should be freaking illegal. That about covers all of my problems though, and I'm hesitant to call any of these deal breakers. The story is just too darn good at its high points, and when you reach that not quite halfway mark, it's just solid the rest of the way through, capped off with a truly fantastic ending. Not to mention it's non-linear, as there are moments where you, or Lloyd I guess, is asked what to do and things can progress in a different manner than normal. There aren't any different endings or anything crazy that I call the game too influenced by player choice though, which is fine by me. This is just a way to make subsequent playthroughs more varied. The game's ending can change a little bit based on certain party members' fates, but that's about the extent of it. How about those story themes? Like I alluded to earlier, this game tackles incredibly mature and dark subject matter, much to my pleasure. I was pretty shocked even the second time through at some of the events that went down in this game, and the game handled them all with a lot of tact, always a good thing. The game's secondary themes and story topics were pretty great already, such as racism and the deconstruction of the Chosen One archetype. However, the game's main subject, sacrifice, while somewhat tackled in Exilia 2, has a much grander scope than the incredibly personal story of that game, making for two entirely different angles and allowing this game to stick out. The way the characters struggle with the concept of what is and isn't worth sacrificing and for what was thought-provoking, especially when it came to our protagonist Lloyd. Making Lloyd the naive, pure-intentioned hero he is was a great decision because we see how much his ideals clash with reality. Lloyd doesn't want to sacrifice anyone for anything and believes with all his heart that there's a way for everyone to be happy. But unfortunately, that just isn't how the real world works, and we see him struggle with that. Even still, he does everything he can to sacrifice as little as possible, and his strength helps him to motivate his team. This makes him a great leader who learns over the course of the game while never losing sight of his ideals. I thought Lloyd was a great protagonist and character who grew up without completely changing who he is. I love the boy. He's a good boy. Other characters coming to terms with this and laying down what they feel is necessary for the sake of the world made for a lot of heartbreaking decisions, whether they were accepting inevitable losses or making desperate attempts to take the easy way out. This kind of storytelling is a major reason why I love this series so much, and why Symphonia's story is so damn good. I talked about them a bit, so let's talk about them more. The cast of Symphonia is yet another fantastic group of personalities. Lloyd is an excellent character whose ideals are tested to the absolute limit, and everyone else has so much more depth than meets the eye. I didn't remember this cast being too great, but I've got to say that Symphonia's got a top tier cast in the series full of top tier characters. Zelos Wilder. Holy crap, one of my very favorite characters in the series, and what a total 180 because I hated this guy at the start of my first playthrough. Finding out more about him, seeing his many interactions, and being unable to hate that devilish smile, I've adopted him as my son. Colette's inner struggles were a lot more interesting than I remembered, and I found myself loving her a lot more than before. She's honestly right behind Zelos for me. I think the story kinda kicks her while she's down a little too much, harkening back to my point of the story having a few detours I could have gone without, but this makes her a very strong character who I couldn't help but love. Brisea as Baby, Genus dealing with discrimination tugged at my heartstrings, Sheena finding confidence in herself was a sight to behold. I don't want to go in on every single character, but the cast is really good. It's unfortunate that I see this group getting a fair amount of heat these days. Almost everyone featured excellent characterization, development, and character progression. The only weak link for me personally was Rain, because while she had some excellent moments in certain side quests, she never really opens up in the main story unless you get her affinity level high. More on that in just a sec. There's nothing wrong with developing your characters more through sub-events, but I feel a great character should be well written in the main story, and optional moments should be to develop them even further, showing us how they tick, giving us more insight to everything they stand for, stuff like that. Tales games are normally good with this, but sometimes we get situations like her. When this happens, I can still like the character, but I find that to be an issue with the writing because the point of a character-driven story is to make events surround the characters and how they grow. Don't leave stuff like this out. But okay, let's talk about that whole affinity system. Like I said, there are moments in the story where Lloyd will have to make a decision on what to say or even what to do, and some choices he makes will determine how his party members see him, gaining affinity points or losing some. It's kinda like Exilia 2, or Exilia 2 is kinda like Symphonia, whatever, it's kinda like that, but things such as useful skills in the highest tier of Mystic Arts aren't locked behind the different characters' affinity levels. These are more here to determine which characters you find out the most about. I used to be very against this whole thing, other than some optional scenes that occur with the character who has the most affinity points with Lloyd. There's one scene in particular near the end of the game where you can decide between your top 3 affinity characters, top 4 in the original, to have a fantastic scene with, giving a great amount of insight to their character. Each scene is excellent and worth viewing on YouTube or something after you play through the game, but I wish you weren't limited to a max of 3 in one playthrough. I wish there was a way to get this kind of character insight in some other way, because a lot of these scenes hammer in how much depth this cast has, and I wish there was at least a way to actively check the affinity rankings on New Game Plus. That first time through, sure, keep it hidden, but in a second playthrough, I know it's there, we all know it's there, just let me check who's ranked in what order so I don't have to keep track of all this myself and can max out the characters I want. Let me emphasize that this doesn't ruin the cast. You still get a lot of development, characterization, and information on the characters regardless of if you watch their high affinity exclusive scenes or not, and that's why I don't hate this idea as much as I used to. I didn't remember so many scenarios in the game that act as excellent character moments and could only think of the missable Flanor scenes per playthrough. See, this is why I'm replaying these games for the retrospective. I want to give you all an educated opinion on the titles. That being said, it's all those extra bits that make Tales casts so good, and those extra bits are what's locked behind the affinity system. Not a bunch of side quests you can do in a single playthrough, so I can't help but knock the game for that. A good idea, but definitely something more for a shorter JRPG and a bit of a disservice to what's one of the series' finest casts. And my dude, the antagonists in this game are some of the very best in the series. The main antagonist is one of my top 3 favorites in the series at this point, and it was great finding out their motivations and why they act the way they do. On top of all this, the world building was excellent, the game's lore was intriguing, that ending, mwah! My goodness, I love almost everything about this story. Minus the hiccups and my mixed opinions on the whole affinity system, Symphonia's tale is a very high point of the game, and one of the biggest reasons I remember the entry as a whole so fondly. The story wasn't as good as I remembered, it was even better. And what more could I ask for? Well, I could ask for a good-ass real-time battle system. Welcome one and all to the very first Tales battle system to feature a 3D battlefield, hence the name Multi-Line Linear Motion Battle System. Multi-line to represent this infinite number of multiple lines between a character and their target. You know, because 3D. Let's go over the game's mechanics, shall we? In Symphonia, you can attack, use arts, jump, switch targets, use items, and switch your controlled character. Typical stuff. Most of the time, but there are a couple of things that make this game stand out even today. First off, there's a bit of depth to arts. For starters, arts will either be level 1, 2, or 3 and can be chained together in that order, allowing for more than the series would be typical based to Arcane Chain. Then the arts you learn over the course of the game could be part of 1 out of 2 different art progression trees. The S-type, T-type scale next to a character's portrait in the pause menu dictates what kind of arts you'll learn. For example, you can learn Fierce Demon Fang or Double Demon Fang depending on which side you grow your character towards, all decided by what type of EX skills you have equipped, more on that later. Finding out how this worked was a lot of fun, and using a guide to see which side learns what arts gave me a lot to think about in terms of how I want to build my characters. This was a cool idea, and even though you can't really get everything, that's okay, it's just a different kind of attack. Finally, arts can be altered. I thought Vesperia was the first game to do this, but it actually started here and was in Rebirth in Destiny PS2. The latter two were Japan exclusive, so you can see why I wasn't aware of their inclusion until now. Also, I guess Abyss technically counts, but I wouldn't really count Field of Phonons. Sorry, I'm getting off topic. Anyway, Symphonia has altered arts, and to use them you have to have some sort of elemental equipment on the character, and the art in question has to be able to be altered by that element and have been used at least 200 times. The requirements are a bit specific, hence why I didn't know about them until I was told they were a thing, but alas, they're here and pretty cool. Unfortunately, you can't ever learn them, which is a shame. It wouldn't be until 2 Team Symphonia games later where you can learn these, but they're cool to use when your equipment happens to line up, I guess. This felt like an afterthought and doesn't enhance the combat enough to make much of a difference. For the next big feature to combat, there are unison attacks. Whenever this gauge fills up, you can press a specific button to hit the enemy and then have the whole squad use an art in the enemy without using any TP. The target can't move while this is happening, so it's free damage. And if you use certain combinations of arts like Lloyd's Tiger Blade and Genus Lightning, you can finish the unison attack with a combo attack, like our example's results, Lightning Tiger Blade. It's a cool way to dish out more damage, and with unison attacks being able to cancel spells and deal with an enemy's overlimit, it adds strategy in terms of when to use it. Oh yeah, this game has overlimit. If you take a decent amount of direct hits in a short period of time, your character's tension will rise, indicated by their character portrait emanating some serious anime energy. You can also raise tension by cooking various foods characters like. Keep taking damage and your character will then decide to enter over limit, where you take less damage, cast spells quicker, and can't stagger for a limited amount of time. You can even whip out some mystic arts in ridiculously specific situations as anyone except Sheena, so I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't even know they were a thing in this game. Another game, another bad over limit. Although this one was the first to introduce the concept, so I should be saying as the first entry to use this, it's a rough start. The most control you have over this is taking damage on purpose and cooking only food characters in your party likes, but even then your character isn't guaranteed to enter over limit and you could find yourself just dying or wasting ingredients. I guess it's supposed to be a sort of desperation move, but being that you have no control over it and it's never guaranteed, it doesn't even work as that. Also, why can I not see how much time I have left in over limit? The timer is completely invisible, making it possible to end up in somewhat awkward situations because you didn't know how much time you had left in the state. And who the heck thought these mystic art requirements were a good idea? Some are fine, like using a specific art a certain amount of times, then using that art in over limit to activate the mystic art. Fair enough. But some characters require you to be below 16% health to use the attack? And freaking Presea has a mystic art that requires every party member to be KO'd and she has to be below 16%. Literally what? Mystic arts are extra, sure, but these requirements are so strange. The very next Team Symphonia game streamlined this a lot, which is great, but that doesn't make this game's requirements any better. Finally, let's talk about EX skills, this game's skill system. Look at the screen I'm showing you, it's almost as simple as it looks. You get various EX skill gems over the course of the game that range from level 1 to 4, and you have 4 slots to equip them to. Equip a skill gem and you'll be able to choose one of 4 skill options that vary from character to character. If you have certain combinations of skills, you can unlock a compound EX skill like Lloyd's Critical Up by having the specific skills, in our example's case, Strong and Personal equipped at one time. And although you're inclined to save a specific level of an EX gem for a different slot, you're allowed to mix and match them in any way you want, like having 2 level 1 gems, all level 4 gems attached, so on and so forth. It's interesting, but so limited, although I can see why it was designed this way. You're supposed to mix and match from a short list in order to make compound skills, not rely on skills for combat. These feel like bonuses rather than the backbone of the battle system like more recent titles, which isn't a bad thing at all. In fact, when looking at the skill system this way, I found myself enjoying it more and experimenting not only to tip the TS skills the way I wanted, but also give my characters different perks to use in battle alongside my own skill. It was fun, although I can understand why the term fun isn't what comes to mind when discussing this game's combat system for a lot of people. First and foremost, let's talk about free running. The ability to move on the Z-axis to reposition myself, dodge attacks, or free myself from the confines of the X and Y axes. Being on a 3D battlefield and the feature acting as such a natural addition to the series, it's unfortunate that it was introduced in Abyss, not Symphonia. Even though the game's in 3D and enemies can clearly run in any direction they want, the player cannot. This gets annoying every now and then, like when an enemy has you cornered and the only way you can get out is by jumping over them and you can't get enough momentum, so you're stuck and the claustrophobia starts kicking in. But other than that, I don't know, I guess I missed it. I just don't think this game needed it, and I never found myself saying, man, I sure do miss free run more than like 5% of the time. The limitations of this combat system, ironically, are what make it so interesting and fun to come back to. I think this is what the kiddos refer to as retro appeal. It's annoying that I can't control over limit at first, but eventually I just forgot about it, and every time it'd pop up I'd say, oh yeah, that. I found myself learning to rely on things that were in my control, like when to use unison attacks, chaining different levels of arts, and when the best time to use items was. Tales of Symphonia is a very limited game, but that works in its favor. Actually, I'd call it more strict than limiting. It doesn't feel as if the game is missing features, it felt like it wanted me to try out different methods to make it out on top. This isn't a simplified version of future battle systems. The very next Team Symphonia game sort of sidestepped from what this game set out to be, making Symphonia more of its own beast. The likes of Abyss, Vesperia, and the such don't feel like better versions of this game. Tales of Symphonia, rather, is its own thing that doesn't give you the same options as later titles, but delivers enough room for the player to use strategy in their personal skill level. I understand, though, that not everyone will see it like this. If you're used to all the modern editions, Symphonia will be a very hard game to come back to for lack of free running and a few other issues. This game's magic guard uses TP, meaning if you're low on that, you aren't guarding an enemy spell, which can get very annoying, especially near the beginning of the game where you're so gosh darn low on money to afford orange gels. No gold means no new equipment or no items, and that can get frustrating. In fact, it was so frustrating that I switched my difficulty to normal for this playthrough. I was gonna play through Symphonia on hard mode this time around, but I kept running out of items, and since I had no new equipment, it was a pain, and I found myself either taking forever to defeat normal enemies enemies or crawling my way out of bosses. They're such damage sponges on higher difficulties, and when you can't combo to dish out damage faster, let alone afford to use too many arts, it can get very annoying, and most prominently, it wasn't fun. Normal mode gave me a much more enjoyable and comfortable experience that still caught me off guard every now and then, so my thirst for challenge wasn't completely ignored. There's also a major lack of level 2 arts for a big portion of the game's beginning. Spellcasting is the biggest snooze fest ever until you get some skills, and the AI is stupid. There are barely any options in the game's strategy menu either to change their behavior to your liking, so that's fun. We love a frail mage casting right in the enemy's face with no way to tell them to stay back. So yeah, the battle system's an interesting beast. More often than not, it's the make it break it feature for Tales games, and I'd say if we're being as critical as we can, Symphonia is one of the most average Tales battle systems nowadays. That being said, yeah, the phrase retro appeal pretty much nails it for me. Tales of Symphonia's combat, much like the story, is a slow burn. The beginning of the game could easily turn a lot of people off, but I feel that if you stick with it, the game will grow on you and allow you to use your skill above anything else to come out on top with some cool mechanics and room for strategy. I don't look at this game for what it isn't, but what it is, because rather than limiting you, the game more so feels like it was trying to do its own thing, and Abyss began to push the series in a different direction. If you go into the game with that mindset, I'm sure you can get a lot more out of the game. But again, I don't blame you if the lack of modern additions is too great a shift to get over. Maybe try easing into the game by starting with newer titles and working your way down to it. As for me, I can still get a load of enjoyment out of the game and a fun time over countless battles over this most recent playthrough. If anything, this isn't the Tales game that's hardest for me to come back to, that's for sure. Long story short, Symphonia's got some interesting ideas that are very different than how the series is now, let alone games that feature the same type of linear motion battle system. It's not for everyone, but it's definitely more enjoyable than it's given credit. Ah yes, the rest of the game. Well, we're in the home stretch, my dudes, so let's get crack-a-lackin', starting with the towns and cities. They're really good and help further immerse me into the world just as they should. Each one is also a decent size, and in combination with the series' tradition of having lots of NPCs to talk to, all having interesting things to say, I love this game's collection of towns. There were also more pit stops and mini rest areas, and I'm a fan of these. They help make the game feel more believable and alive, which I appreciate. It's too bad that to get to them, you have to go through one of the series' worst world maps. This is bad. Real bad. Your movement speed is so freaking slow, and enemies are sometimes unavoidable. Look at this crap. How the heck am I supposed to avoid fighting something that bum rushes me like this? What's the point of making enemies on the overworld if encounters like these might as well have been random? Thankfully, there's a way to move faster on the world map far before you get this game's aerial mobility option, and that's thanks to one of the game's mascot characters, Noish. You can find these stone tablets that cover a specific chunk of the world map, and once you find it, you're able to ride Noish and use his faster movement speed to get to locations quicker and actually avoid enemies. Heck, while on Noish, enemy blobs only move when you do, which I found hilarious. That being said, finding these requires you to go completely out of your way, meaning a lot of people will miss out on these, and even if you do know about them, you still have to find them, and all the dead ends with constant stopping thanks to unavoidable enemies is frustrating as hell. When you finally get Noish, it's a bit better, but by the time you'd have all the stones necessary to use Noish on the world map, you have your aircraft. And Noish isn't even that fast, he just moves at a more reasonable pace than this garbage. The layout of the world is interesting enough, but let me go through it at a good movement speed. Heck, you're able to travel faster through a skill Lloyd can learn, but that doesn't apply to the world map, only towns and dungeons, so rip. But yes, the dungeons. I was looking forward to this topic. Tales games aren't really known for these, but Symphonia sets itself apart in this category because it arguably features the most interesting and involved dungeon design in the series. Most, if not all, the dungeons have a puzzle to solve in order to move forward, more often than not surrounding the Sorcerer's Ring. Unlike other games where the Sorcerer's Ring shoots off energy, the Sorcerer's Ring starts as that, but constantly changes its properties from dungeon to dungeon, starting off as a ball of fire to becoming a spark of lightning, night vision, a shrinking device, a freaking bomb, so on and so forth. I love this, as it makes dungeons that much more memorable and fun to traverse through. Nothing here is to the level of something seen in the typical Zelda game, and a couple of dungeons fall under the trap of having to go back and forth rather than having a puzzle solvable in one room or on one go, even if you know what to do. But there's honest to goodness effort, and that's all I want from a Tales dungeon. I'm well aware that there are a couple of annoying dungeons. I always find myself looking up the Temple of Winds puzzle because of how cryptic it is. This segment in the Temple of Lightning was always a pain, and the Temple of Darkness can literally die in a fire for all I care. Like, oh my god, dude. Oh my god. These little shadow punks need to never show their face in any future game ever again. But let's not forget the great ones such as Emir Forest, Walgaia, the Temple of Ice, Tower of Salvation, Tower of Mana, Remote Island Human Ranch, so on, so forth, you get the point. The good far outweighs the bad, and I just appreciate that these were given the amount of love and care we see while playing the game. Heck, I only find myself disliking one dungeon in its entirety, and that can be amounted to the game's creators being overly ambitious for the time. No matter if things were less than stellar, I always found myself seeing where they were coming from, and wondering how it would be if they had the proper hardware intended or rough edges smoothed out. I can only hope that dungeons have this kind of time put into them in future Tales games, because while more recent entries have been alright at this, I still want more because I've seen more. Symphonia's dungeons are great, and I hope we see something similar in the future. Anyway, I guess that about covers it. There are some smaller things I could go over, but I feel like this is just about everything I wanted to talk about as spoiler-free as possible, of course. What do you say we finish this thing off? Tales of Symphonia was as interesting to revisit as I was expecting. After playing through the game again, I can understand both sides of the argument even more. There are a lot of things I love about this game, like the 100% solid soundtrack, great voice work on both ends, a story that until Berseria was my favorite in the series. Towns and dungeons are some of, if not the best Tales has seen to this day, and the battle system still holds up in its own way. However, I can also see why people aren't as fond of the game as they used to be, and why many feel that its age has caught up with it. I don't think the game holds up graphically, nearly half of the dialogue isn't voiced, the world map is one of the worst in the series, and I can't deny how rough it can be coming back to this game for all its battle system doesn't have. But I've stated my piece on the combat system already, it was never trying to have any of that new stuff. The lack of a free run option is so blown out of proportion, and when you take the game for what it is, you can find some enjoyment out of it. The beginning of Symphonia is as bad as it gets, and I understand how that can be a turnoff for many. First impressions determine so much in life, and even as I came back to this game, playing through the beginning wasn't super fun. I remember lamenting on Twitter how Symphonia was way more dated than I remembered after my first couple of play sessions, and I was sad that not only my first review of 2020 would be negative, but my second as well. But the more I played the game, the more things started to chill out, the more the story progressed and kept improving, and the more fun I began to have. The other playable characters who are a blast to play as started to join my party, like Sheena, Persea, and Best Boy Zelos. The world opened up and it was better than I remembered. I was having so much fun that I didn't want to stop playing and gathering footage. Recording sessions started to average out to 2, even 3 hours. I started seeing this game as the pretty bow on top of the classic Tales era that incorporated 3D aspects into a game based on 2D movement, before entering the phase of the series where freedom of 3D movement opened up combat that much more. With that in mind, the game still holds up as one of my personal favorites in the series. Symphonia can be a good time. Symphonia is a good time. Just don't start with it. I think it's great and all that Symphonia is the most popular Tales game, some people's only Tales game, and a huge reason as to why so many people got into the series in the first place. But this is not a game I'd recommend anyone to start with. It isn't newcomer friendly and has some dated designs that are easier to get behind if you go in with the mindset that the games do in fact improve from here on out. But once you played a few Tales games, come back to this one knowing that it's different. Not necessarily older, but different. I say this because Symphonia is showing a little bit of age, but I still respect it for all it's done for the series and personally love it to pieces. Now that Symphonia is done, the question is, what's next? Well, I've been exclusively reviewing Mothership titles, but I also wanted to review at least most of the spin-off games and escort titles that don't get the attention a lot of them deserve. I'm aiming to do all the Mothership titles at the very least before Arise comes out, so these may be saved for later, but I at least want to talk about the more prominent ones. Why bring this up all of a sudden? Well, Tales of Symphonia, like Exilia, got a sequel. But unlike Exilia, this sequel isn't a Mothership title, but rather an escort title developed by Team Symphonia's B team at the same time as Vesperia. And this decision would result in it becoming the controversial beast it is today. You know what? A part of the reason I'm even doing this retrospective is to revisit Tales games and see how my opinions on them have changed, if at all. And Dawn of the New World is one of the games I've been meaning to revisit the most. So, screw it! Let's review Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World next. I don't remember liking this game all that much, but anything's possible, and we'll be seeing if this game can win me over next time.
And he won't do that alone.